Hey Viking fans, Cy Amundson here with a fan question version of Vikings at Home. We are one day away from the NFL draft, so we source questions from you, the Purple Faithful, and to answer them, we are going to bring in two of your favorite writers. First, from ESPN.com, ladies and gentlemen, Courtney Cronin, and from The Athletic, Jon Krawcyznski. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
It's a pretty simple concept. This is going to be a really weird draft, guys, and obviously none of us here speak for the team, but we thought who better to answer some of our fans' questions than the two people who spend the most time analyzing and covering them. The one hitch, I'm going to give you 45 seconds each to answer each question, and then at the end, because I have to make everything about myself, I'm going to pick a winner. First question. Which is more likely, the Vikings trading up to grab a better player or trading down and increasing the amount of players they can add to the mix? And Courtney, we'll start with you.
Well, I don't think that there are many circumstances that you would want to trade up unless you were going to draft a quarterback. We already know this about the Vikings. They have 5 picks in the 105, in the top 105 at 22, 25, 58, 89, and that compensatory pick, which is huge, at 105. I think the smart play here is to use one of those first-round draft picks on a cornerback, let's say, or potentially an offensive tackle if one is there that the Vikings would like to kind of work into the mix, and then trade back, let's say now from 25, to be able to garner more draft capital, to use that on a receiver, to use it on an edge rusher. You can do a lot of those things in the later rounds starting on day 2 to preserve and earn some more draft capital instead of using both your first-round picks.
Here's the way that I look at it. We have seen Rick Spielman be aggressive when he sees a player slide that he thinks he can go up and get, and that whether that's in the first round or any of the other rounds in the draft. I think the more likely scenario is you maybe trade back in round 1, but on that second day in round 2, if a receiver is sliding down that they really like, if there's a defensive back that is sliding down that they really like and they took a tackle in round 1, that's when they might use some of the extra capital that they accrued from any move back in on day 1 to move up on day 2, day 3, and go get those kinds of players. I think that Rick Spielman really is aggressive in these types of situations, so I can see him moving up, but just probably not on day 1.
Well, let's talk about one of the other possible options, because Justin Rash wants to know, with 5 picks in the first 3 rounds and a shortened offseason, do you see any situation where
left tackle, the Vikings obviously have a need on the offensive line, and if they could get someone that came in right away and was ready to go, maybe they consider it, but I still think that with their salary cap situation and a lot of the holes that they need to fill, I still think that they're going to look for volume in this draft. And how you get volume is by making moves around in the draft and getting young, affordable talent in that draft. They are up against the cap pretty tightly right now. And so I think the best thing for them, and probably the most likely scenario, is that they do try and get young guys that can come in and play right away. Garrett Bradbury did that last year maybe there's more of that.
In order for the Vikings to absorb a cap hit north of $14 million for Trent Williams, they're going to have to make some moves with their own roster, whether that means trading Riley Reif to Washington, potentially Anthony Harris. They'd probably have to do it with a player and also packaging a pick in that trade as well. And when you take a look at the offensive line, this is probably going to be the group most affected by a shortened offseason. Think about how long Garrett Bradbury needed to kind of season in the Vikings offense before he was really ready to contribute. Yes, we know he was a day one starter, but we didn't see him make an impact until a little bit later in the season. OTAs are important for rookies of all shapes and sizes, but particularly for the offensive line. That's the group that's going to be hit hardest. If you can get a veteran in right away to be able to kind of mitigate those problems, I think you're in the right situation to do it.
Well, let's talk about the position that has a ton of depth throughout the draft, the wide receiver class. Skullman wants to know, with the depth at wide receiver this year, how long can we wait to draft a quality guy while filling some of those other needs with earlier picks?
I think you can wait until day 2. I think, like we mentioned earlier, this is a scenario where Rick Spielman will want to trade out of the first round using only one of those first round picks to be able to get another day 2 pick, potentially even have 3 in that third round, maybe 2 in the second round. To replace Stephon Diggs, it's not going to take just one singular player. And the best part about this receiver class, there's receivers in all different shapes and sizes. You want a good deep threat? Go get TCU's Jalen Reagor in the second round. You want an outside option? USC's Michael Pittman. Everybody in every draft sim that's been sent to me has Tyler Johnson coming to the Vikings somewhere in the third round. Great slot option. I think that you can get multiple receivers in this draft starting on day 2 and have just as good value if you were to get one in the first round.
Well, and here's the other thing that you factor in with receivers is a lot of times it is a position that requires length of time, maybe a year, 2, 3 years before these guys really come into their own and are ready to play and make big impacts. And what we have seen from the Vikings in their draft history is they have success later in the draft with receivers or even in the undrafted area. Now, you can't depend on getting an Adam Thielen in undrafted free agency or a Stephon Diggs in the 5th round, but we have seen them identify talent at that position and then make it develop into impact players. So I don't think they need to be in a rush to go receiver first round.
Well, if the Vikings keep both of those first round picks, 22 and 25 right now, Blake Dean wants to know, should they draft for need, i.e. cornerback, O-line, wide receiver with both of them, or do you take one with need and you spend the other one on the best player available no matter who it is?
It's a great question, and actually best player available might be filling a need for the Vikings as well. I think they'd be really hard pressed at 22, just based on how the offensive tackles come off the board, to pass up on one of the top offensive linemen that are available in the draft. I did a mock draft for ESPN.com recently, and there were 6 tackles taken, including the man I took at 22, Josh Jones. I think that's a really smart play for the Vikings because you just don't know, at least right now, what's going to happen with Riley Reif in the 2020 season. And beyond that, having somebody in ready to go, maybe having a year to learn the offense and, grow from a developmental prospect into somebody who could potentially take over the left tackle spot in 2021.
The Vikings have so many needs right now. It's hard to see them taking a player that doesn't fit a need and also is a really good player with those picks in the first 2 rounds. I mean, if you take an offensive lineman, guard or tackle, and most likely tackle in the first round, it's going to fill a need. If you take a receiver, it's going to fill a need. If you take a cornerback, it's going to fill a need. If you take a defensive tackle, it's going to fill a need. And what also has to be noted is that Rick Spielman and George Paton do not hesitate to go best player available if they really think one is up above some of the other areas of need for them. But I just think they have so many areas of need that they're going to be able to kill 2 birds with 1 stone with those picks.
And speaking of something that's not really a need, but it's a question I love when it gets asked, will the Vikings draft a QB in the later rounds? And if so, is there anybody in particular you like? Oh, there's always a QB question. You could have Joe Montana backed up by taller Joe Montana, and people would still be like, we're going to take a QB?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, everyone wants a quarterback in every draft, I think, unless you have Patrick Mahomes or Tom Brady. And the Vikings have Kirk Cousins, who has had some really good statistical seasons. But I think if you want to look at adding someone for depth, it makes all the sense in the world to do something a little bit later in the draft. I think that by the time they look for someone, because Kirk Cousins is still firmly in his prime, you don't look for someone that's going to be ready in 1 year or 2 years. You look for someone who can develop over the next 2 to 3 to 4 years and be ready if and when you have to move on from Kirk Cousins down the road. And that's why I do think Anthony Gordon from Washington State is somebody to watch. I mean, you look at Gardner Minshew was there, Luke Falk is there, Mike Leach, really coached up some really good quarterbacks.
I think it's actually the smart play. I mean, like you mentioned, John, that 4th round kind of feels like the sweet spot for the Vikings to enact a move like this. Will Jalen Hurts be there? Probably not. He's probably going to be gone at some point on day 2. But somebody that I really liked, I first saw him at the Senior Bowl, was James Morgan out of FIU. 12 interceptions over the last 2 years. Mike Zimmer's going to love that because he doesn't turn the ball over that much. Good size, strong arm. And when you're the Minnesota Vikings, yes, Kirk Cousins signed the contract extension during free agency. He's here through the 2022 season. But at some point, if you decided to move on from Cousins, don't start over at square one.
Well, here's the final question, and we let somebody sneak in with a non-draft question. I know we're talking draft, but I want to know, which Viking do you think has the best chance to lead the league statistically at their position next year?
Well, I'm going to go with Anthony Harris because he did it this past year. He led the league in interceptions with 6. And if he does end up signing that long-term deal with the Vikings and they don't draft a safety, I mean, I think he could potentially do it again in 2020. Over the last 2 years, he's allowed the lowest passer rating among all players at his position. He's one of the best coverage safeties in the NFL, and he's also a really good run stopper. He's only missed 4 tackles in the last 100 attempts. He's somebody, I think, that coupled with Harrison Smith, the Vikings could have one of the best, if not the best, safety tandems in the NFL in 2020. So, I mean, he's my safe bet. You could also go with Eric Kendricks leading the league in tackles potentially from his position. We know that he had 12 passes defended. That was the most by a linebacker in 2019. Who's to say that both of them don't lead the league statistically at their positions?
I love it. It reminds me a little bit of that, the old Legion of Boom, with 2 veteran safeties and a bunch of young corners just ripping the league up. John?
Yeah, my selection is Danielle Hunter. As for when you look at his ascension to one of the dominant defensive ends in this league, I think he can be a guy who could lead the league in sacks. It just seems like he has the mental makeup, he has the physical ability, and he seems to be on such an upward trajectory with this defense that he's already a star, and I think that he could still make another stride or 2 in his development. And I know that Mike Zimmer and the defensive coaches have been working hard with him, and he is going to be one of the very leaders and cornerstones of this defense for a long, long time. I just think he's going to become an almost impossible guy to deal with. So that's my pick, Danielle Hunter, leading the league in sacks.
Both great answers, which makes sense because you guys are both incredible. Thank you for doing this. It was my only job was to keep time. And I'm sucking up to Courtney. I love her writing, and I need to score points with her. Please, everybody, please, everybody, check out John's work on The Athletic, Courtney Cronin on ESPN.com, and everybody enjoy this year's NFL draft.